We've learned to add and subtract integers. Now it's time to think about how to multiply them. I want to first refer to the checker model. And of course, way back when you were little, you learned how to model things like 4 times 3. Using the checker models, that you could think of that as 4 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 4. If I remember that the black checkers make positives, if I want to do 4 groups of 3, I could make here, this is the second group of 3, the third group of 3, the fourth group of 3. So I can see clearly that I've modeled that 4 groups of 3 is 12. I've also actually modeled 3 groups of 4 is 12. But what about when I make it negative? Negative 4 times 3. What does it look like if I take 3 groups of negative 4? So now instead, these checkers will all be negatives. They're red. Rather than draw a whole new diagram, I'm just going to look at it like this. I'm going to see that clearly when I have 3 groups of negative 4, here's one group of negative 4, a second group of negative 4, and a third group of negative 4. Altogether, I have 12 negatives. In other words, negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. I could use the same diagram to show that negative 3, 4 groups of negative 3 in 4 groups is also negative 12. So these particular examples show when one of my numbers is negative and I multiply it by a positive, I get a negative. In other words, if I have different signs, it equals a negative. You can also see here that I had the same signs. I had positive 4 times positive 3, and that equaled positive 12. And while I can't really model negative 4 times negative 3, you can see this example right below. The negative 4 is the same. The only thing that's different, I'm going to multiply it by the opposite. So it stands to reason that I would get the opposite of this answer. These examples show us that if I have the same signs, in other words, if they're both positive or both negative, it gives me a positive. But be cautioned that this only works for 2 numbers at a time. It's the basic and important thing about multiplying, but you have to remember that it only works 2 numbers at a time because, well, let's just look at a pretty simple example. Negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, using the same signs positive idea, I might think that the answer is positive 1. But knowing that I can only use that rule 2 numbers at a time, this negative 1 times this negative 1 gives me positive 1 because they have same signs, so it makes it positive. When I then multiply this by the negative, I have different signs, positive and a negative, and therefore it equals negative 1. In class today, we went on to explore other examples, like what if I multiply it by another negative 1? Well, we already know that these 3 equal negative 1, so if I multiply it by another one, it becomes positive 1. And if I were to multiply that by another negative, it would be negative 1. We then also had a discussion about a problem that, I don't know, I can't remember the numbers we used, but let's say it was this. A pretty in-depth discussion about how could I predict, just looking at this, what the sign of the answer would be. And after a long time of debate, we realized that these 2 would give a positive, and they would then be multiplied by positive. so it will equal a positive number. In the end, about multiplying is if you're multiplying more than two numbers at a time, sorry, times take a while, you need to count the negative signs. An even number of negatives equals positive, and an odd number of negatives equals a negative, because any two negatives make a positive. So you put them in groups of two and it will all be positive. So let's just, I'm just making these numbers up, -3 times 4 times -8. Okay, how many negative signs do I have? 1, 2. 2 is an even number. Therefore, this will end up being a positive number. And 12 times 8 is 96, so this is positive 96. But the point really is the positive sign. When we were starting the homework, some kids then, when we went back to the easy ones, like -6 times 7, they're like, uh-oh, what's the sign of that? Well, how many negatives are there? There's one negative. 1 is an odd number, therefore this is going to be a negative answer. It is -42. If I say -2 times -5 times -3 times 6, I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. 3 is an odd number, therefore this answer is going to be negative, and it is -180 if you actually do the math. This makes perfect sense for one thing that we're going to be doing tomorrow. If I say -2 to the third power, we know an exponent means to multiply this by itself that many times. So -2 times -2 times -2 is -8, because there are 1, 2, 3 negatives, and 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. -2 to the fourth power, however, is -2 times -2 times -2 times -2, which gives me positive 16, because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, an even number of negatives. So, this will be for your weekend homework. A negative number raised to an even power equals a positive, like this one. An even number of negatives makes positive. A negative number raised to an odd power, odd power equals a negative. And those are the basics that you need to know when you are multiplying integers.